Hey guys, it's Mathel here once again, giving you another starter build edition for the new and latest league, and in this case it is Betrayal League. Betrayal League introduces a few new skills while also revamping quite a few cold-based skills, and in this starter build video I want to give you 4 builds, 2 of which have new skills or reworked skills involved, and 2 of which should just be reliable and tried and tested sort of skills and starter characters. Now, as always, starting builds are not necessarily the greatest thing in the world. They are simply designed to get you going in the game up to red tier maps at the very least, cheaply, effectively, and have a good start to the league where you can then invest heavier and get yourself into the deep end game, but it will cost you more, or you can start your next project with a nice healthy base of maps and currency to get going. Typically, I will probably get my characters to about level 85 or 90, establish a map base, and then try out another character rather than go all the way into endgame, because it does take quite a lot of effort as your first character, starting with nothing, to take them into the endgame. So simply put, these are just to get yourself started, established, and have a good time on the first few days to a week in the newest league. Now, before we get started with the actual builds, I will mention, as always, currently Arc Totems is still an insane starter. Haven't included it as a guide in this one, but I did do that as a previous starter build in the Delve video. Arc Totems still very reliable and should clear the entire game, as per no nerfs seen to it currently. And then also Champion Double Strike is just another great starter. I think that was one of my incursion starter builds that you can check out, and basically, you can't go wrong with Champion anything, but Double Strike is just such a well-scaling, well-rounded start for the melee side of things, that if you want to do some melee, then that's a very good choice as well. Now, to get things started, I want to show the character that I am most likely going to be trying myself, because there seems to be a lot to figure out with how this will work and whether or not it'll be any good. So I want to sort of do the front running for that one myself, and that is Lancing Steel and Shattering Steel Champion. So these are the 2 new ranged impale type abilities that are coming into the game. They are based around a new mechanic called Impale, which will do additional physical damage over a few hits, and as well as that, they are purely projectile based, but they seem to be kind of like a melee physical type of attack, and they both look somewhat promising to me. Lancing Steel looks like the one I really want to try out, and the one I would love to test immediately at the start of the league. It will be a champion. Champion has some nice Impale synergy to go with the rest of the type of damage that the build has, but Champion itself is always probably my most reliable league starting ascendancy, because it just has such nice quality of life coming from the ascendancy, and it does scale some really busted damage in the end if you want to take it right through to the end game. If these 2 skills kind of fail, it can easily turn into a double strike champion, or any skill really. It will be a pretty generic champion tree. You can chuck any skill in, most types of gear, and then you'll have some pretty insane levels of damage, thanks to Champion being the way it is, scaling off of crit swords, just how it currently does. So the 2 new skills we are looking at for this build are Shattering Steel and Lancing Steel, and as I mentioned, Lancing Steel is the one I'm personally more interested in. Currently don't really know what level you get them at. Could be very early level. I would assume Shattering Steel is pretty early, like 1 to 12, and I assume Lancing Steel is maybe 12 or 28. No idea though, but as always, up until then you can run some Molten Strike, some Frost Blades, whatever else you really want to, just to start leveling until you get these. Now, they do have a new mechanic which is called Impale, so whenever you hit something with an Impale, it will store 10% of that impaled damage hit as an impale, and then everything you hit for the next 5 hits will deal that additional 10% damage. It's kind of confusing, but there is an impale sort of description you can read in the path of building when you hover over Impale in Champion, as well as on the announcement for these skills themselves. Basically, just count it as a bit of extra damage that's going to be coming in after you get your Impale going. So The one we're looking at is Lancing Steel primarily. The primary projectile will always be impaling on hit, so you'll always be getting that slight additional damage. The base damage here isn't terribly high, but if you hit all of your projectiles, you get more damage happening. So it really does matter as to whether or not you're hitting all of your projectiles, because they technically shotgun in that if they all hit, they're all going to be doing damage. So that's what you're looking to do. We might be running GMP, something like that, maybe some chain projectile. We'll see how we go with that as we go, because like I said, this is one I'm really not too sure about. It might suck total balls, it might be incredible, but I have to try and plan it out myself and play it and see how it goes. So I will be starting this character, and it does look something like this. A champion, just have a spectral throw gem in path of building at the moment for reference, because that's similar enough of a projectile type skill to at least get some gems attached to it. The build will be revolved around swords at this point, so you do take the sword node over here for plenty of crit and attack speed, and it's going to be pretty loose. It doesn't have to be a two-hander, doesn't have to be dual wield, doesn't have to be shield. It can be any one of those, but I'm starting out with the idea to go maybe a Terminus Est, or maybe dual wielding or shield with something like a Growwood Shank potentially, but it's very loose in that the passive tree is generic enough that if you want to go one way or the other, there's only a few points you have to respec. So currently we are starting out as two-handed as the goal of the build, and that just means you take Destroyer over here, and it also means you take Wrecking Ball. If you don't want to be two-handed, if you want to dual wield instead, you just grab these 2 points here, then you grab these points down here, or if you want to use a shield, you grab Defiance, or you'll grab Retaliation as well. So basically, we'll be traveling along, leveling, and trying out different setups, and we won't necessarily be using any sort of commitment to a type of setup. So take these sorts of nodes, probably kind of last in your setup, but you can go for just generic damage through your proj node, getting down to point blank. Chances are we do want point blank for the huge amount of extra damage when we're up close. You want sword nodes eventually, but then we also travel all the way up here so that we can get a bit of extra crit and some int happening as well. You can build this completely differently and skip this entire side of the tree and go to the left and grab some sword nodes. If you want to be axes, you can grab axe nodes as well, but I did it this way up here because otherwise we're going to be just a little low on crit, because melee crit obviously doesn't work for it, and there's not much crit to be gotten on this side of the tree, so I figure we want to go that way. It pretty much builds itself. You will be just traveling along this way, grabbing stuff as you go. You don't necessarily want the sword nodes too early, because you might be running around with axes for a while, who really knows, and if you really do start to struggle on damage, it's definitely worth picking up whatever spec that you're currently doing. And in this case, like I said, probably two hands, maybe dual wield, so it's worth picking up those nodes, and then go up here and grab the life whenever you feel like you need it. Gear should probably be pretty straightforward. A Star Conjurer's going to be running Diamond Flask, try and get some sort of jewels that have physical damage, maybe attack speed. Currently, with the two-handed version, we're going crit multi for two-hand there. Quite likely going to try out Hemophilia for additional clear speed, because the Bleed Explosions could very well feel quite good for this sort of thing, or even be necessary based off of how the skill currently looks. No idea how the skill supports are going to be. Currently we just have Brutality, Chance to Bleed, Maim, Vicious Proj, and Crit Strikes as our last one. You should probably be running Herald of Purity, a Blasphemy Vulnerability, Vile Haste or Vile Double Strike as your additional Vile skill damage, and then an Ancestral Protector that's your totem of choice, just so it can give you some extra attack speed during boss fights. And then as far as the Ascendancy route is concerned, you probably want to be pushing towards Worthy Foe as one of your first actions. Your normal lab isn't very good if you're going for Conqueror, so your first lab can easily be Unstoppable Hero for normal lab, which gives you a lot of extra armor and damage for once you have Fortify up. So early on that makes you very tanky. Then once you get to Cruel Lab, you probably unspec these two. It costs 5 regrets per refund point here, so it costs 10 regrets or 10 refund points to unspec that. Once you have Cruel Lab, you grab Worthy Foe and you do start to deal a lot of damage. Or you could go Master of Metal and try out the new Impale stuff very early on. I might actually do that as well, because Scaling that physical as your very first normal lab act means that you will have quite a lot of extra damage while leveling. The 4 to 8 per impale ends up being quite a lot of damage at that early level. So I don't think there's any real wrong choice here. You can grab just about any one of these as normal lab and then towards cruel lab. Overall, this will probably be your 4 points though for the build. Like I said, not too sure how this is going to go. It's probably one I'm going to be going and learning as I play and giving you updates on in the first few days. But like I said, it's pretty much a champion. You can convert it into a double strike or most other types of champion and have a very successful league starter either way. This is simply if you want to try out the new stuff. The next somewhat provisional build I want to showcase is Ice Spear Totems with the new and reworked Ice Spear. Now it still functions somewhat similarly to how it used to, in that it has a 2-stage process. After a few meters or a few feet shot in front of you, it turns into another stage of its skill that then has more crit and more crit multi, so it is more powerful to get a bit of a range happening on this skill, and once it turns into that level of damage, it should be slightly better. So you want to be placing totems with this skill a little bit further away from the enemies and trying to get your max range there happening so that it has much higher crit multi. This time though, it does now scale off of more projectiles. Previously, one projectile of your Ice Spear would hit an enemy and it would do some damage. Now you scale multiple projectiles onto the skill, and then every consequential projectile that hits will do more and more damage. So in this type of a setup, we are going for something like 8 projectiles. And for this type of skill, I'm planning to do a Scion, though you can very easily do Hierophant as well, though I'm just going to showcase a Scion version for the totems here, because I feel like it might be just a slightly more comfortable starter. However, entirely up to you. Now in the background here is a just demo and showcase of what Ice Spear used to look like when I built around it about a year ago. Still should probably perform somewhat similarly, but it's obviously not going to be anything like this in this version, and it isn't a self-cast, it will be a totem character. So here we have the new reworked Ice Spear. It has a very high crit chance, just like it used to, and 80% effectiveness of damage. The beginning damage isn't too huge, 360 to 550, but it fires an additional projectile, so already you are looking to try and get both of those hits to hit one enemy, and then it has some pretty respectable damage. You can see that the second form, when it turns into that second form, has a lot more crit chance, so it's pretty much impossible to not crit with this thing once you have your passive tree happening, and then a bunch more crit multi as well. So the idea behind this skill for our setup will be to put it into a totem setup and place something like depending on the setup, but 3 to 5 totems in total, and you can place them at range if you want. So then your second phase of Ice Spear will actually be hitting quite profusely, and that was actually one of the problems when I played self-cast Ice Spear, making sure you were far enough away from the enemy and it wasn't coming close on you, so that you could actually get the second form happening and get the damage going. So totems for this actually seems like kind of a intuitive setup, and it won't necessarily be a Hierophant this time, though it easily can be. You can see a very nice totem synergy in this Ascendancy, and it is how I built my Arc Totem character. However, if you go the Scion route, there are quite some good nodes here as well. Hierophant in the Scion area gives you +1 totem, as well as Arcane Surge whenever you're casting your shit. And then on top of that, we're going Deadeye, which gives you quite a bit of dexterity that you will need throughout the game. And then it also pierces 2 times, so the initial first phase of your Ice Spear never pierces, it only pierces on the second phase. So this will help get through some enemies on your first phase, so that it can then hit with the second phase and also keep piercing that way. As well as that, it's got a pretty important skills fire an additional projectile, so in total you should have quite a lot of projectiles, because currently we are planning to use the jewel here, Rain of Splinters, which gives you 2 additional projectiles. Ice Spear itself has an additional projectile, so you're already at 3. Then you get Deadeye over here, you're now at another one, and in total, if you end up running GMP, which we quite possibly will, I think we have something like 8 or 9 projectiles for this skill, and if they all hit, that should be a shitload of damage. So currently we're looking at Spell Totem, Ice Spear, potentially GMP as your next link, Controlled Destruction, Cold Penetration, and then this isn't the actual gem we're looking for. We are currently looking to put into the build as well as that multiple totem support, so that every time you cast a totem, you'll be placing 2 totems instead, which should help with your clear speed and feel for the build. As well as that, you will then have 2 additional totems, and it should be a well worth support putting into your totem setup, so that you can in the end maximize up to 5 totems in this build, though you might be able to get more totems coming from veiled mods, as we've seen so far. Currently, I'm not planning around that at all, and I'm recommending you run a Terran's Shiver early on, which is a very, very cheap weapon for an endgame setup, and then you can eventually build into a Power Charge on Crit Staff that just primarily gives you a 7th link in your setup, and that does help a lot for our damage. Power Charge on Crit won't actually do anything itself for your totem setup because you can't get power charges from your totems that way. It's just going to be pure extra damage. However, you will be getting power charges through an Orb of Storms Curse on Hit Power Charge on Crit setup. So you drop your Orb of Storms in between several packs and you will maintain power charge on Crit that way, while also gaining a Frostbite Curse on the enemies. You won't probably have almost any of your mana reserved. You're just running Clarity, maybe Herald of Ice if it feels good. It's not a huge amount of extra damage, but it might help you get a bit of extra damage happening in the build. And the reason we're running so much mana and unreserving our mana is because of Mind Over Matter as a defensive node. You grab Mind Over Matter, and then a lot of the damage you take goes to your mana. And since we have a lot of mana and a lot of mana regen, it ends up functioning as a strong defensive barrier. Other than that, the passive tree is kind of all over the place. You are a Scion. You want to try and get some of the quality of life nodes fairly early on, like that, and then moving up into Ancestral Bond. Early on, you probably just want Ancestral Bond as soon as possible, so you will most likely go through these nodes and then refund them when it's slightly more efficient to go around this way. But you do want as many totems as you possibly can early on, so Ancestral Bond is a very good choice early on, and you'll probably play self-cast, Ice Spear, Ice Nova, Vortex, all kinds of other shit until you can get to the sort of totem side of things, because chances are it won't be that smooth of a leveling thing until you get that, or you can run Arc early on, maybe Arc Totems, before you actually start to ramp your build, which does require a few little things like your Rain of Splinters, like your proper Ascendancy, and a few proper passive tree points. Now, I do currently also have Elemental Equilibrium spec'd onto the tree here, but you won't actually have it in the build, so it's just showing you what it's supposed to be doing, because the idea here is to have a Malachai's Artifice Ring, and then run a lightning trap and a Vaal lightning trap in it, so that for boss fights you throw down a lightning trap and get a huge amount of extra cold negative resist, and that should help do quite a lot of extra boss damage. That's something that's new to me, but I think it should work out. And if you really need to know how to build a proper totem character to base this one off of, go to my Arc Hierophant Totems, and it is a very good and very well-rounded starting build as well. The next build I'd like to recommend as a starter is something that doesn't happen too often, and that is a bow character. Now, bow characters are notoriously rather hard to start, and this isn't too much of an exception, but it is actually going to probably be the nicest bow starting character you could have for quite a long time, because of Scourge Arrow. This would be Scourge Arrow flat cold stacking, so the idea is to stack plenty of just additional cold damage to your bow skills, and then you'll be a Deadeye using Scourge Arrow, or you could also run several other types of abilities like Rain of Arrows, start out with Shrapnel Shot most likely, use Lightning Arrow, Ice Shot. I do recommend you try all kinds of bow skills in this setup, but Scourge Arrow, once you can get it, I think at 28, proves to be one of the strongest bow skills in the game at the moment. This paired with the fact that you can run Mirage Archer, which is the green sort of dude on top of the character here when you're running around. He shoots whenever you're really not doing anything, just passively. That does make bow leveling a lot nicer than it's ever been before. So a flat, cold stacking Scourge arrow should actually be one of the first real bow characters that can take you right from the start to the end, depending on how much you invest into this character. Should have a very solid defense base with a lot of evasion, dodge, and spell dodge, and a very fast sort of character playstyle as a Deadeye. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be cold. I think that's just the easiest way to start out, but it could also be lightning, as is showcased in this video and the first Scourge arrow build that I actually showed you guys. Now you can use my original Scourge Arrow lightning based character from the Delver League as a good reference point for Scourge Arrow and how to build it, but I do have a mock-up of the one I'm talking about, which is just pure cold damage and flat cold stacking. So it involves having most of your damage coming in from added cold damage, some Abyssal Jewels with cold on them, as well as probably early on you do most likely want to run some Ice Bite. Just for the first few levels, and then you're going to get a lot of cold damage coming in from Hyri's Ire, which is now reworked to have roughly the same amount of damage as an added cold gem, and then ideally you're running a bow that has a little bit of double damage as well as cold and crit. So something like this one, a shaped bow, but you can very early on start with a Hope Shredder. Just be careful of the frenzy charge damage coming in there. So you probably don't want to run anything like Blood Rage when running a Hope Shredder unless you can really handle the degen, but it is a very good starting bow for this sort of thing. Ideally, you bump up into just a little bit of a double damage shaped bow that then gets you just a little bit of crit as well, and that means you won't be taking any degen from the Hope Shredder. Otherwise, the build is pretty straightforward as far as a bow build is concerned. You are just going life, movement speed on boots, trying to get your crit multi through your amulet. Some flat stacking goes very far across the board if you try and get some additional cold damage on your amulet, on your rings, Abyssal Jewels. So these jewels probably aren't even ideal. You're better off with Abyssal Jewels that do cold damage to attacks, cold damage to bows, maybe some life if you can get it, and then of course a quiver that has a bit of crit multi, bit of early damage. Early on you will probably be running Mirage Archer as one of your staples as well as added cold damage, but try out plenty of other different skills. It doesn't necessarily have to be Scourge Arrow from the start. It just usually scales the best into endgame, but Rain of Arrows, Vile Rain of Arrows early on, Shrapnel Shot, Lightning Arrow, Ice Shot, Tornado Shot, Split Arrow even. You can play around with lots of different things and it should get you going. Most likely for the setup you will be running Herald of Ice, and it will be attached to Curse on Hit Assassin's Mark that will keep up power charges throughout general gameplay. Otherwise you can reserve your mana with a Haste and a Vile Haste and then a Vile Grace as well, just for those tough situations. And that means that we do have quite a lot of evasion, spell dodge, and attack dodge to go with, because in this build we are grabbing acrobatics, going through to phase acrobatics, and thanks to Hyri's Ire, having quite a decent amount of beginning sort of dodge and spell dodge. That does mean you have a lot of evasion and a lot of dodge and spell dodge. And as well as that, the passive tree is pretty generic for a bow character. Most bow trees you see are going to look something like this. There's no real right move as to which way you go. If you start this way and go up to the shadow tree, you'll be filling out more damage and a bit more int, whereas if you go to the left, you'll be filling out a little less damage, but then going towards your life base that will help keep you alive. You do want point blank in these types of builds because it's a huge extra amount of damage when you're up close to enemies, and we are a Deadeye in this situation. Your first 2 points should usually go to Gathering Wind because Tailwind is insane. Personally, then I probably like to go fast and deadly so that you fill out your accuracy and then you also have a much nicer rate of blink arrowing. Past that, you then grab Rupture so that you bleed things quite often. That gives you some good sustain for life gain on hit, and then some really good crit and crit multi, and then you're always piercing everything, so this is just a bunch of extra crit that's pretty worth doing, because otherwise we're going to Fast Shot, which isn't too worth it if we're running point blank, as well as Ricochet, Endless Munitions. Not that insane for this type of a build, though something to mention, an additional projectile in Scourge Arrow will mean that instead of firing in a pure line all the time, you'll then cluster your Scourge arrow pods around an enemy, so an additional arrow that you'll probably want to get off of a quiver will be an increase to your single target boss damage. The last character that I will recommend will be something of a basic character. It's on the melee side of things. If you just want something a little bit tankier, a little bit more simple, it will be a Consecrated Path Chieftain. And it can also use the new reworked Tectonic Slam, which just currently deals a bit more damage and has sort of an RNG clear, but Tectonic Slam was reworked, so it might be worth giving a shot in this type of build as well. But the idea around this build will be Consecrated Path, which is this golden looking skill that kind of has a little teleport aspect to it, but also has a pretty large area and large amount of fire damage. So we will be a full fire build in this case using a Doomsower sword, and this is a kind of just a basic build that should get you up to red tier maps and clearing red tier maps at a comfortable level, and then potentially scaling into some end game if you invest a whole lot more into it. But this is the kind of build that I want you to be comfortable using right from the get-go, even if you don't have too much gear or too much experience in Path of Exile. I would say it's probably going to be a true starter build that you can really get and work your way through the game early on without really knowing what the fuck you're doing. So these types of melee builds are very easy to start because they're very basic passive trees that give you decent amount of life early on while maintaining very good damage as well. They don't require much gear, they don't require much for your weapon to do anything, and you can interchange it with plenty of other skills to try things out to level as you see fit. And in this case, like I said, I have chosen Marauder Chieftain for this build. So the Chieftain Ascendancy is very fire based. It converts 50% of your damage, physical damage, into fire, where with Consecrated Path it already does 50%, so that will make you a full fire build, giving you lots of fire penetration, and then some extra leech, and covering something in ash gives you a bunch of extra damage as well. You then have another couple of points which don't really matter too much. You can either grab these for more damage for your totems, which I would recommend using with your Ancestral War Chief, and then this so that you can get endurance charges kept up easily. If you'd really rather, you can drop these 2 points and grab these 2 just to fill out a bit more resists and have even easier requirements on your gear for resists and life. But currently this is the one I've chosen for you, but you should be doing these for your first 4 and then seeing how you go with the build as you're going, and what you want to grab whenever you want to grab it. Now this type of stuff, like I said, very easy to build early on. You get plenty of life and damage right from the start, and if you go for resolute techniques as soon as you can, that makes your character feel very smooth because you will always be hitting and you won't have to worry about your accuracy anymore. You then want to hold off on grabbing your actual sword nodes here. So we have sword specific over here, but you want to hold off on doing that. You probably want to just go straight up to the Templar area, get some area, some int, and then go down and start grabbing some of your penetration, some of your other physical damage, because you want to be able to pick up whatever weapon you can and use it. So you don't want to just only focus on swords. When you have no currency, no gear, you really want to keep a very flexible sort of playstyle. So if you pick up an axe, you want to be doing good damage with that axe. If you're spec'd into your swords, then you've pigeonholed yourself into one type of weapon. The endgame weapon for this, as soon as you can, would be a Doomsower. You can run plenty of other unique weapons up until this point. A Doomsower, however, is a very solid, well-rounded weapon that gives you a bit of extra area as well as extra damage when you put your links into it. And it's very cheap and can do most of the content in the game, I would say, though you could scale this with a Terminus Est as well, for example. You could do it in Namahu if you want to do an axe version of the build, and the rest of the gear should be very basic, nothing too special happening here, just some extra elemental damage on your rings if you can get it. An Elder Amulet that can roll some extra fire damage would go a long way, and then probably pick just 2 of these flasks, so either Tiri's Promise, Lion's Roar, or Wise Oak, as well as a Silver Flask, and then use those. If you run all 3 unique flasks, you'll probably not manage to get a Curse Flask in as well, Curse Immunity that is, but really up to you how defensive and how offensive you want to make your flask setup. Make sure you have a Life Flask as your 5th one though. So like I said, very basic build here, just should get you going, should feel good early on with whatever gear you throw at it. And we are currently planning to run Consecrated Path here with these links. Your 6th link in this case should be Increased Area, swapped out for Conk Effect whenever you're doing bosses, but those are your basic links. As well as that, I do have Tectonic Slam links set up for you in case you want to play around with that. And then Vile Double Strike you can always get into your setup if you need some extra single target, or Vile Ancestral War Chief if you need some single target there as well. You'll probably be running Herald of Ash, Herald of Purity, and also Blasphemy Flammability. Now, the way you'll be getting mana back in this build is these 3 points here. Up until you have this, you're probably going to be just maintaining off of a life flask. Once you get this, your mana should be pretty good, but you may need to maintain a mana flask until you have a good enough base of damage and mana pool so that your leech is actually doing something. So that actually concludes the starter builds, just 4 builds, a couple that should be real solid, a couple that might be a little bit questionable, but I do have faith in. And also randomly put together and figure I will give you something that might just be a little bit more questionable once again, but quite fun. And that is a very fast Debeon Dirge Cyclone Raider. So if you remember back in Breach League, when Namahu's first came out, I made a Cyclone Raider based off of the Namahu axe, and it was one of the fastest and most enjoyable Cyclones I'd ever had. At this point, you can probably go faster with a Debeon's Dirge, which is a pretty cheap weapon because it gives you some movement speed whenever you walk right, and the Duresso's Defiance, which is getting changed or buffed rather to have increased onslaught effect, meaning that you can get up to 200% increased onslaught effect with this passive route. You can get a lot of movement speed from frenzies. You get lots and lots of movement speed from instant Warcrying your Debeon's Dirge, and then the damage should actually be pretty respectable. The play speed will be insane because you'll be so fast just running around everywhere. You then grab some Darkrai Vectors for extra movement speed as well. You can go full potato with a Devoto's Devotion as well, and really the world is your oyster for how fast you want to make this thing, but it should be just one of those things that can get you through maps super quick, not necessarily the greatest build in the world or one that's going to scale into endgame, but if you want to play around with the new chest and something that's just a little bit faster and very fun, this is one I'll link you guys as well. So that concludes the starter build video for Betrayal. Thank you very much for watching, guys. I hope you have an amazing start. Like I said, I will probably do the champion Lancing Steel myself to see just how it feels, if it's a really good skill, because it looks pretty damn nice. But that's it from me, guys. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.